Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's information session for childcare providers participating in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. My name is Julia Banks, and I'm a communications manager in the Division of Early Learning at the Office of the State Superintendent of Education, also known as OSSE. And today we'll be sharing information about monitoring requirements for the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund program. Before we jump into the meeting, we want to take a few minutes to address some housekeeping details and walk through some Zoom features. Please note that today's session will be recorded and the recording will be shared with childcare providers in the coming days. If we can move forward 2 slides, please. So as you're likely familiar with from our previous session, we are using Zoom webinar to conduct this session. And because we're in webinar mode, all attendees are automatically muted and their video is off. As usual, I'll highlight a few Zoom engagement features to get started. First are the language channels, which you can find by clicking the globe icon found on the bar at the bottom of your screen and highlighted on this slide in orange. In addition to offering today's sessions in English, there are Spanish and Amharic language channels set up. Please click the icon and select the language you would like to tune into. If you're in the English call, you should still click that EN button to join the English call. I will now invite the moderators from the Spanish and Amharic language channels to provide instructions for individuals who would like to attend the session in one of those languages.
Buenos días. Hoy estamos ofreciendo interpretación al español. Si usted necesita escuchar esta sesión en español y está en una computadora, deberá seleccionar el idioma. El canal de idioma. Aparecerá un icono aparecido en globo terráqueo en la parte inferior de su pantalla. Debe seleccionarlo y después debe seleccionar español. También si está usted en una tablet o en un smartphone, debe seleccionar los 3 puntos en la parte inferior derecha de la pantalla de Zoom, luego en interpretación de idiomas y después en español. Si no selecciona el idioma, no podrá escuchar al intérprete durante la sesión. Puede seleccionar la opción silenciar el idioma original si no desea escuchar el inglés al fondo. Estas instrucciones las dejaré en el cuadro de chat.
ጤና ይስጥልኝ እንደምን ዋላችሁ። ይሄንን ስብሰባ በአማርኛ ትርጉም መከታተል ለምትፈልጉ ከስክሪኑ በታች ግሎብ የምታለውን ቢጫ ብርቱካንማዋን መርጣችሁ በትርጉሙን በአማርኛ መከታተል ትችላላችሁ። አገባቡ በስልክም በታብሌትም በኮምፒውተርም ላይ ተመሳሳይ ነው። መልካም ቀን።
Thank you. We'll now walk through a few additional Zoom features. So we'll be using the chat feature highlighted on the screen with a green box throughout today's session to share links and other informations with attendees to reference. We also, on this slide, highlight the Leave Meeting button, which is highlighted in purple. If you need to leave the meeting early, you can just click that button. And then finally, we have the Q&A feature. If you have questions you'd like to ask during the session, please submit them using the Q&A. We'll go into a little more detail on how to use the Q&A on the next slide. So here's what the Q&A will look like on your screen. To submit a question, just type it in the box seen here highlighted in red and then click submit. I'll note that we will do our best to answer all the questions that come in during today's session. If you have questions that are not addressed during the meeting, please email ossi.ecepayequity@dc.gov. Next, I'd like to highlight that we have translated slides in addition to our language channels. If we can go to our next slide, please. We dropped the links in the chat at the top of the call. Oh, they should be in this deck. They are not. We will put them in the chat once more so that you are able to access the translated slides. These slides can also be found in the attachment section of the Pay Equity Fund webpage on the OSSE website. And we will also put that in the chat. So if you are looking for the translated slides from today, check out the chat. The links are there. On the next slide, I'll introduce you quickly to today's speakers. This afternoon, you'll hear from Hannah Matthews, Director of Policy Planning and Research in the Division of Early Learning at OSSE, and Angela Spinella, the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund Program Manager. Before handing things over to Hannah and Angela, I'll walk through our agenda and make a few important notes. If we can head to our next slide. We will start out today's session with an overview of the fiscal year 2024 monitoring policy. The monitoring policy applies to all child care providers participating in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. We will then walk through how to submit monitoring documentation. The process we will review is for child care providers who participate in the Pay Equity Fund but do not also participate in the Child Care Subsidy Program. I'll repeat that again. The monitoring process we will walk through today is for child care providers who do not participate in the subsidy program. Most child care providers who participate in the subsidy program and the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund will be monitored for compliance with requirements of both programs in the fall and will receive more information about the process for doing so later this summer. OSSI is having subsidy providers complete the monitoring process for both the subsidy program and the Pay Equity Fund at the same time, as many of the reporting requirements overlap, and this will help to streamline the process for providers. I will pause here to make two important notes. First, some subsidy providers will be monitored before the fall because OSSI has received reports of potential non-compliance. Providers being monitored in response to reports of potential noncompliance will receive a notification from OSSI with instructions to complete the monitoring process. Second, there are a small number of child care providers who operate some facilities that participate in the child care subsidy program and some facilities that do not participate in the subsidy program. Child care providers who operate a mix of non-subsidy and subsidy facilities will be required to complete the monitoring process we'll be detailing today for their facilities that do not participate in the child care subsidy program. I know that was a lot to soak in, so we'll walk through all of those and then we will have time for Q&A before closing out this afternoon. So with that overview of our agenda, I will hand things over to Hannah.
Great. Thanks so much, Julia, and hello to everyone joining our call today. So to begin, we're going to start with an overview of the monitoring policy for fiscal year 24 of the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. We are going to drop in the chat a link to the monitoring policy. That's going to give you a lot more explanation around what's going to be coming. Please, again, as Julia said, feel free to submit questions during the presentation using the Q&A feature, and we will try to get to as many as we can. Next slide. So OSSI will monitor all providers participating in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. As you know, we began in fiscal year 24 distributing pay equity funds directly to child development facilities to increase compensation for early educators through what we call the Child Development Facility Payroll Funding Formula. We will be monitoring all providers participating in the fund. While the process for submitting documentation required for monitoring that we're going to walk through today is for child care providers who do not participate in the child care subsidy program, the monitoring policy that I'm going to walk through will apply to all child care providers participating in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. In other words, we'll be monitoring all providers through the same policy. How you submit and when you submit the documentation will vary whether you are a subsidy or a non-subsidy provider. Each quarter, participating child development facilities will be monitored for compliance with the minimum salary requirements and other requirements that have been established in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund Provider Agreement. It's important to note here that providers with approved waivers for compliance with the minimum salaries will be monitored for compliance with program and waiver requirements, but are not required to meet the minimum salaries established by OSSI. OSSI will monitor the salaries and credentials of lead teachers and assistant teachers, and associate home caregivers who are employed by participating providers at least annually through review of payroll and related documents and staff records that provide evidence of the salaries or wages paid to those educators. Next slide, please. The monitoring timeline is based on when a provider enters the program. So the earliest that a provider will be monitored is the quarter following receipt of the first quarterly Child Development Facility Payroll Funding Formula Award. OSSI will notify providers individually when monitoring begins. Each provider will then have 30 days from the day they are notified to submit the required documentation to OSSI. Next slide, please. All participating providers will be required to submit supporting documentation for the period that is being monitored. On this slide, you can see a table that specifies the time frame for which documentation must be submitted relative to each quarter. I want to note here that quarter one of fiscal year 2024 was the period from October 1 through December 31st, 2023. Because providers were not required to increase staff salaries until after receiving the first award payment, providers that received a payment in quarter one will be monitored for compliance with salary requirements beginning in the quarter following receipt of payment. So for providers who joined in quarter one, we will be monitoring compliance with those minimum salaries beginning January 1st through March 30th, 2024. I'll note here that childcare providers are still required to submit documentation of salaries paid during the quarter they entered the program, but OSSI will not require compliance with the minimum salaries prior to a provider's receipt of the first quarterly payment from the fund. This means if you participated in quarter one, you will provide OSSI documentation of salaries paid between October 1st and December 31st, but those salaries will not be monitored for meeting minimum salary requirements. You will then continue to provide payroll information for each quarter after that first quarterly payment, and we will monitor for compliance with the minimum salary requirements. We'll talk a little bit more about what this documentation looks like on the next slide. All providers are required to submit the following documentation that you see here on the slide to meet the fiscal reporting requirements of the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. These documents include staff salaries or wages, staff offer or hire letters or contracts that are signed, dated, and include relevant salary information. All providers must submit evidence of the salaries or wages paid to staff. This may include documents from your payroll systems. It may include canceled checks made out to employees, payroll tax documents, pay stubs, electronic bills, payment services documentation, or bank statements that show records of payroll transactions. We understand that there are lots of different business practices, and we will work with you to make sure that we get the documents that you have concerning the wages that you've paid in order to monitor for compliance. Next slide. Documentation will need, as I mentioned, the various forms, that documentation will need to be submitted to OSSI for all teachers, assistant teachers, and associate home caregivers who are employed by the provider during the period of review. The documentation requirements are for staff who are employed in an eligible staff type for any portion of the period being monitored, regardless of whether they are included in the provider's quarterly award statement. So from the time an individual is employed at your facility, we will be monitoring during the relevant quarters compliance with the minimum salaries. I want to note here that home providers and expanded home providers who are self-employed do not need to provide documentation of their own wages or salaries. What home providers or expanded home providers will need to show is required documentation for any associate home caregivers or eligible employees who are employed by the provider. Next slide. Now, in addition to submitting information about salary and payroll records, there are some non-fiscal requirements that we will be monitoring for all participating providers. The first one is participation in classroom observations. All participating providers are required to participate in observations as part of their Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund provider agreement. For providers with preschool classrooms, this means participation in the Classroom Assessment Scoring System, also known as CLAS. Observations for providers with infant and toddler classrooms means participation in an environment rating scale, often known as ERS. Providers will not need to submit observation data directly to OSSI. OSSI has partners that conducts the class and the ERS and will report the information to OSSI so that we know that you have complied with the requirement to participate in those observations. We will also be asking for enrollment data from facilities. For enrollment data, providers must report to OSSI data on enrollment by age group for the month following receipt of the first CDF payroll funding formula award and the month following receipt of each quarterly award thereafter to date. So we're asking for your quarterly enrollment. Providers who do not track enrollment data by month or do not have enrollment data for prior months should indicate that in their submission, but must report current enrollment by age group. So in other words, we are looking for point in time enrollment for each quarter that you participated in the fund. If that prior data is not available, we will ask for current enrollment data. Next slide. There is also a requirement in the provider agreement for the reporting of tuition data. For tuition data, this must be reported to OSSI on the undiscounted current tuition rate by age group. So a few things to flag here. We are looking for the undiscounted tuition rate. That means that the rate reported should not reflect sibling discounts, sliding fee scale application, lower rates that may be charged to parents who enrolled prior to a rate increase or received some other discount compared to the price charged to other families. Second, programs may report tuition on an hourly, daily, weekly, monthly, or school year basis. We just need you to tell us what that tuition is based on, but you may choose how you report it. Third, programs should report the tuition rate that would be charged for a child newly enrolling in the program for the first time in the current month or at the next available enrollment opportunity, whichever applies. And finally, programs that do not enroll children continuously throughout the year may report the tuition rate that will be charged to a child at the next available enrollment opportunity. I want to be very clear that OSSI will monitor whether providers submit the required enrollment and tuition data, but we will not be using this data for any evaluation or to determine compliance with the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund program requirements. Next slide, please. Okay. I also want to mention additional fiscal reporting requirements for providers with an approved waiver of the fiscal year 24 minimum salaries. So as we've talked about there are a set of providers who have waivers to not comply with the minimum salaries. And so the monitoring here is going to be a little bit different. In addition to the fiscal reporting requirements that I detailed, meaning you will still submit all of the required documentation, there is some additional information that will be provided to OSSI. So if you have an approved waiver, you will also be submitting a salary schedule, which describes the wages or salaries paid to eligible teachers or assistant teachers following the receipt of the first quarterly award. So in other words, what are the minimum wages or salaries that your facility is paying to those eligible educators? As a reminder, those salaries or wages must be higher than those that were paid as of September 30th, 2023. We will also ask for financial data and reports that demonstrate that the quarterly awards were used for only the following purposes in accordance with the waiver agreement. Those funds may be used to increase wages or compensation of eligible teachers and assistant teachers, including payroll taxes. They may be used to cover administrative costs associated with implementing the salary scales and meeting OSSI requirements related to the Pay Equity Fund, or covering the costs of health and other fringe benefits for early educators and other child development facility employees. Those are the only permissible uses of funds for those who have an approved waiver. Next slide. Providers with approved waivers also have a requirement to participate in technical assistance from the DC Shared Services Business Alliance. You will not need to submit proof of participation in that support. OSSI will work directly with the DC Shared Services Business Alliance to get a report of child development facilities that participated in the technical assistance, but it is a requirement of the approved waiver. In the monitoring process, OSSI will use authoritative data sources to assess accuracy, completeness, and compliance. This includes the minimum required salaries for early educators in facilities participating in the Pay Equity Fund by role and credential, staffing roles as indicated and approved in the Division of Early Learning licensing tool, DELT. So we'll be looking at those staff roles. The highest credential of staff members, again, as indicated with appropriate attachments and documentation and approved in DELT. Staff position changes, so documentation by staff change forms or staff resignation or termination letters submitted in DELT. Those also must be signed and dated. And we will look at any other relevant policy guidance or documents published by OSSI for the Pay Equity Fund to determine compliance. After providers submit the required monitoring documentation, OSSI will review the documentation and issue monitoring findings to providers for the period of review. Based on OSSI's review, a provider will be issued a finding of compliant or non-compliant. Let's walk through what each of those mean. Providers without a waiver will be found compliant if minimum salaries are met for all eligible educators. Providers with an approved waiver will be found compliant if salaries were higher for all eligible educators than the salaries that were paid prior to September 30th, 2023, and if funds were spent in accordance with the waiver requirement. I want to pause here and just remind folks that when we're referring to waivers in this context, we are referring to waivers of the minimum salary requirements for the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. We are not referring to any waivers associated with the licensing regulations. Now, on the flip side, non-compliance. Any provider who is will be found non-compliant if they fail to submit required documentation on the timeline prescribed by OSSI. For those providers without an approved waiver, a finding of non-compliance will occur if minimum salaries are unmet for some or all eligible educators. For those providers with an approved waiver, a non-compliant finding will indicate that they did not pay eligible staff salaries that exceeded those salaries paid prior to September 30th or did not use funds solely for approved purposes. Any provider found to be non-compliant will be given a corrective action plan. The provider must do the following. They must immediately implement the corrective action plan to comply with the requirements by completing one of the following. The provider must correct the finding and provide proof of compliance with minimum salary requirements that includes a plan for reconciling any paid owed to eligible educators. Or the provider must submit an application for a waiver for compliance with the minimum salary requirements. It is possible for a provider found to be non-compliant to appeal the determination. Appeals must be submitted using the Request for Non-Compliance review form. The form must include supporting documentation. OSSI will review all appeal submissions and issue another determination. An appeal determination will be approved by the Deputy Superintendent of Early Learning, and all appeal decisions are final. Should a provider who is found to be non-compliant fail to come into compliance in the timeline designated by OSSI, the facility will remain on probationary status and be subject to increased monitoring. Following 2 non-compliance findings, the provider may be identified on mychildcare.dc.gov as non-compliant with the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. Following 3 non-compliance findings, the provider may be terminated from the fund for a minimum of 1 year. Providers who are terminated from the program may submit a written appeal to OSSI with documentary evidence as to the reason for the appeal. OSSI will review appeal submissions and issue a determination. Again, all appeal determinations will be approved by the Deputy Superintendent of Early Learning and will be final. Before I pass things over to Angela, I want to share this visual representation of the monitoring review process to help summarize all of the information that I just walked through. I won't read through each item, but I want you to have this to be able to look at, to reference at a later date if there are questions about the flow of the monitoring process. And we're going to be putting out lots of information to support you through this process. So with that review of the monitoring policy, I will now hand things over to Angela. Angela?
Thank you, Hannah. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Angela Spinella, and I'm the Pay Equity Fund Program Manager. Today, I'm going to walk you through the process for submitting documentation for monitoring for the Early Childhood Pay Equity Fund. Before I do that, though, I'd like to reiterate that the process I will soon detail is for child care providers who do not participate in the Child Care Subsidy Program. Child care providers who operate both subsidy and non-subsidy facilities will be required to complete this process only for their facilities that do not participate in the Child Care Subsidy Program. As Julia mentioned at the top of the meeting, most providers who participate in the subsidy program and the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund will be monitored for compliance with requirements of both programs in the fall and will receive more information about the monitoring process later this summer. Next slide, please. With that background, let's jump in. OSSI will use two platforms to collect documentation for monitoring: the Division of Early Learning licensing tool, also known as DELT, and the Smartsheet. OSSI recognizes that using multiple platforms to submit required documentation may create an additional layer of complexity and work for childcare providers. We have selected these platforms in an effort to collect data efficiently, given the functionalities and limitations of the current DELT system, while also ensuring that all platforms used to collect data are secure and protect the privacy of personally identifiable information shared by childcare providers about their businesses and staff. As we continue to implement the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund, we will also work to improve and refine our reporting systems. To support providers, we've created a chart that you'll see on this slide that details the various documentation that must be submitted to OSSI and where it should be submitted. The chart also highlights documentation that all participating providers are required to submit, and additional documentation that is only required to be submitted by providers with an approved waiver. Next slide, please. So let's jump into what this looks like in DELT. You will first need to navigate to the DELT homepage. You will then need to log into your provider profile in DELT. You will want to click No if you do not have a dc.gov or k12.dc.gov email account. And that's just for logging into DELT. Next slide, please. You're going to want to enter your email address or username and password associated with your DELT account, and then click Sign In. Next slide, please. For uploading staff hiring letters and updating salary types in DELT, you will then need to navigate to the facility profile by clicking on Facility Profile. Next slide, please. In continuing with the process of uploading staff hiring letters and updating salary types in DELT, you're going to want to click and edit using the pencil icon by selecting the facility to update. As you can see, the pencil icon is highlighted with the red box. Next slide, thank you. Once you have clicked the pencil icon in DELT, you're going to want to click on the Staff tab, as you can see highlighted there. Next slide, thank you. In the Staff tab, you're going to want to make sure you click on the pencil icon to edit an existing staff record. And so you should see multiple staff records here. You're going to want to scroll down to the attachments section and click Browse. Here you will upload the staff hire letter or staff contract. Documentation must be uploaded as a PDF. File names must be clear and indicate their content. For example, John Doe offer letter .pdf. Fields with a red asterisk are required to be completed. Down that slide, please. Oh, back one, please. Thank you. Still here, we are uploading staff hiring letters and updating staff salary types in DELT. So you're going to want to make sure you scroll down to the compensation section and select the correct salary type. For example, you might choose annual, you might choose hourly, and then you're going to want to enter the staff's email address. Again, fields marked with the red asterisk are required to be completed. Next slide. The next step in DELT will be to scroll to the bottom of the page and click Save and Close. It's very important to note, if you need to make updates after clicking Save and Close, you will need to contact OSSI.childcarelicensing at dc.gov and specify the record you want to update. And now I'm going to share my screen to provide a live demonstration in the Smartsheet. Bear with me as we change screens. Give me one moment as we're loading my screen here. Here I have provided the link to the Smartsheet and I'm sharing my screen. You will want to first access this link on one of your saved browsers or favorite browsers. Next, you're going to scroll down to the facility license number section and choose the drop-down arrow to find your facility and license number. You are going to want to select the drop-down arrow and choose the applicable month for the enrollment data you're submitting. So we're scrolling down here. Enter the enrollment data for the first month of each quarter the facility has been enrolled in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund to date. Enter data for all months that apply to the facility. You will see I have chosen October 2023 and therefore populated October enrollment information, January enrollment information, and also April enrollment information. Facilities that do not track enrollment data by month or do not have enrollment data for prior months available can indicate that in the form and will not be penalized, but are required to report the current month enrollment and will be required to report quarterly enrollment in future years. Enter the enrollment data for each of the following groups that are applicable to your facility: infant enrollment, toddler enrollment, and/or preschool enrollment. List the number of children enrolled for the selected quarter by age group. If you do not serve one of the groups, you are not required to enter the information on this group's field, and you should leave it blank. These are not required fields, so you will be able to leave it blank if you do not serve that age group. You will next want to scroll down and enter tuition data for each applicable group that is served by the facility. Identify the frequency of the tuition rate reported for each group of children served at the facility. For example, we have daily, weekly, monthly, by calendar year, school year, or other. This will be based on your facility and what they typically charge families for tuition. Complete each box that's relevant to your facility. Facilities that do not track tuition rates or do not have data on tuition rates for prior months available can indicate that in the form and will not be penalized, but are required to report current tuition as of the date the monitoring data is submitted and will be required to report tuition on a quarterly basis in future fiscal years. Facilities are required to report the undiscounted tuition rate that would be charged for a newly enrolled child who is starting in the program the month the monitoring data is submitted. For example, if you're submitting monitoring data for this facility in July, report the rate you would charge for a child enrolling in July. This rate should not reflect sibling discounts, sliding fee scale application, lower rates continuing to be charged to parents who enrolled prior to a rate increase, or any other discounts the program provides to participating children or families. If the facility exclusively enrolls children whose parents are employed by a specific employer and charges a discount rate for those children, report that rate. If the facility does not enroll children continuously throughout the year because the program operates on a school year basis, report the tuition rate that will be charged for a child enrolling at the next available enrollment opportunity. You will then want to scroll down to the payroll documentation section for all providers and upload payroll documentation. If your facility has an approved waiver, you must also upload additional fiscal and payroll documentation here. Multiple documents can be uploaded at the same time. Files can either be dragged and dropped into the Smartsheet or uploaded from the computer of the person submitting the documentation by clicking Browse Files.
I'm sorry, did you say something else?
Once all required data and documentation has been submitted, click Submit to submit the information to OSSI. If you would like a copy of your responses, you must select Send me a copy of my responses, and an email box will appear here. This field will be required if you do check off that Send me a copy of my responses box. If you operate multiple facilities participating in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund, a form must be completed for each facility. I am now going to stop sharing my screen. Thank you all.
Thank you, Angela and Hannah. Before moving into our Q&A, we would like to do a quick poll to know what language people are attending today's session in. So a poll will launch in just a second on your screen. So please tell us what language you are attending in. The options are English, Spanish, or Amharic. And while we are doing that, I will ask Jarrett to bring the slides back up. Thank you. Alrighty, we'll give folks another 15 seconds or so to respond. Alrighty, thank you everyone for letting us know the language you are attending in. We'll now move into our Q&A. So we'll invite Hannah and Angela back. Let's start with our first question here in the chat. This provider is asking, what if we began paying teachers and assistant teachers effective October 1st, 2023, treating the first quarter payment as a reimbursement? Your timeline does not match up with what we did since we started paying teachers increased wages ahead of when we were required to.
Sure, I can take that. So that's fine. That's not a problem. We do understand that some facilities raised wages for educators prior to receiving their first payroll funding formula award. Because that was not required, we will not be monitoring for compliance until after those awards went out. But if you raised salaries earlier, that's fine, because what we are monitoring for each quarter is that the eligible educators who are employed by your facility are meeting the minimum salary requirements. So as long as you have educators meeting those minimum salaries, you can have started paying them much earlier. You can pay them more than the minimum salaries. What we will be looking for is that eligible educators are earning those minimum salaries in each quarter. The quarters that we define for our monitoring process don't need to align with exactly when you raise salaries, provided that you're meeting those minimum requirements.
Thank you, Hannah. Our next question, I'm wondering what's the purpose of OSSI tracking programs tuitions? Can you provide more information on this, please?
Sure, that's a great question. Happy to take that one as well. So really the goal here is for OSSI to have a better understanding of trends and data on tuition over time. It's not something that we have right now in a systematic way. It's something that we often collect data on. So when we do a market rate survey, this is intended to be so that we don't have to do that survey and can ease the burden from providers in reporting that information to us in that way. We think it's also really relevant to the program, right? We want to be able to track the impacts of the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund over time, and that includes tracking what parents pay for childcare in the district. So we are including this requirement. It was included in the provider agreement. I do want to be really clear, however, that while the information is required to be reported to us, we will not be evaluating at an individual program level the tuition that's charged. This is really for us to have a broad view of the data across the district and understand tuition better.
Thank you, Hannah. Our next question is related to reporting, I think, salary data. So it says, we are a program that follows an academic year, and our school day runs from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. Our staff are compensated by salaries that span over 12 months, even though they work 9.5 months annually. Is there an opportunity to explain our program when submitting documentation as this relates to payroll documentation?
Sure. So thank you for that question. Yes. You should include as much information as needed to be able to document that you have met the minimum salary requirements. So if that means writing notes on documents to explain information to us, if it means submitting additional documentation, we do want you to do that. We understand there are lots of different business models out there. We have put the minimum salaries out in two different forms, right? We have an annual salary. We also have the equivalent in an hourly wage. So what we need is documentation that shows that in either of those two ways, either by the hourly wage that an employee is paid or by their annual salary over a course of a year, that they have met those minimums. So please do indicate anything that is additional information that we need to know to be able to make that determination.
Our next question is related to reporting tuition and enrollment data. So this person is asking, what if our age groups do not fit neatly into the age groups that were described? So I think that was a 12 to 36. They're saying, for example, our toddlers span 18 to 30 months, and our next age group spans 30 to 42. So how should those providers be reporting their enrollment and tuition?
Angela, I think that's a question in terms of the Smartsheet functionality.
And okay, thanks, Hannah. I was going to take it. So if you you will have the ability on the Smartsheet to, it is a like an open text field, so you can document in the Smartsheet. For instance, oh nope, someone else is sharing. But if you, it's a free flowing text box, so you just want to indicate what the age group is that you are documenting there. So just make sure if it's not, if toddlers are a different age group, you're going to want to put that tuition rate and then what is the span of months you're looking at there.
Thank you, Angela. And I think our next question is similar. So this person is asking, what if we have different tuition rates for 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds and different rates for part week and full week 2-year-olds?
Yes, same answer. It is, again, a free-flowing text box, so you will be able to indicate that on the Smartsheet. It is not a drop-down field where you must just enter numerical information. You can provide that to us.
Got it. Okay, our next question. Does it matter if you prorate the minimum annual rate as the teachers only work for 10 months?
So facilities do have flexibility to prorate the annual salary requirements. Again, what we'll be looking for is documentation that you've met those minimum salaries. So if you've prorated the salary, you need to provide a justification for that. You need to document that, and you need to document that you have used that policy equitably across your eligible employees. So in other words, if there's a way that the facility, that the business model works to have prorated that minimum salary, you need to apply that consistently for your eligible employees. So if you have, specific questions about how that applies, we encourage you to reach out. But yes, this is similar to that first question, where if you have additional information that will help us understand how you complied with the minimum salaries, please include it when you submit your payroll information.
Our next question, if a program has not had any staff changes for eligible staff in fiscal year 24, does the program need to upload the salary letter each quarter, or does the salary letter have to be signed each quarter?
I'll take that question. No, that does not have to be uploaded each quarter if it's staying the same. We only require it if the staff information has changed. It should be noted that any staff record updates that need to be completed, the deadline for that is July 31st. So please ensure that if you have anyone who is changing, you are notating that in DELT.
Thanks, Angela. Our next question is, our program was just recently approved for subsidy. We were not approved in Q1, and we have not enrolled children under subsidy since our approval. What do you suggest in terms of reporting? I think this question may be asking if they need to participate in the monitoring process that we rolled out today. And I'll flag that we will, when monitoring launches, we will notify providers, and you'll receive a notification if your monitoring process is the one that we laid out today, or even if you're a subsidy provider, we'll be letting you know that the monitoring process has launched, but you aren't included in the folks who need to do it quite yet. All right, our next question here is, we do not have contracts with our staff since we are an at-will employer, and most of our educators have worked for many years, so their offer letters would not have the pay equity fund salaries noted in them. How should we document their salaries? Would a memo suffice? They don't sign anything annually.
So if there was a written notification to the employees when their salary was raised, that would be useful to have included, even if it's not an original offer letter. Oftentimes there are written communications when a salary is raised. I would say I think we can talk about the specifics of whether or not a memo can suffice, but largely we would like to see that every eligible educator included in the program does have some written notice from their employer confirming the salary or wages that they are paid.
And another question related to the offer letters. It says, what if the offer letters we have are showing previous rates and dates, but did not update the offer letters after the rates were changed after meeting eligibility? Should we update them now and show the current dates for offer letters? The staff were paid accordingly, and the pay stubs and reports will show that.
So I think this is similar to the last question. It will be enormously helpful if offer letters or formal correspondence with employees noting their current salaries are current, up to date, signed and dated in the information that you provide, just as it's outlined in the provider agreement. That will facilitate our monitoring process much more easily.
Our next question, this might be along the lines of the first question that we walked through. For those who raised wages early, starting in October 2023, without full knowledge of fiscal year 25 funding, Will more information be received prior to monitoring of the October through December 2024 period? Based on discussions, wages should be kept at the minimum salaries through December 2024.
Julia, can you repeat what the question is?
For those who raise salaries in October 2023, will more information be received prior to the monitoring of the October through December 2024 period? That might be a question that we just need more details to find out what they're asking.
That's right. I mean, the headline is that any participating provider, once they are participating in the program, is committing to paying the minimum salaries for each quarter in which they're participating in the program. So regardless of when the provider chose to begin meeting those minimum salary requirements, if you are in the program in fiscal year 24 and through the duration of fiscal year 24, then we would expect to be able to monitor and see compliance with those minimum salaries through December 2024, which would be following the fourth quarter payment.
Got it. Alrighty. I can see the individual who sent that in was an anonymous attendee. If you would like to follow up via email, please do so. That's aussie.ecepayequity@dc.gov. Let's see, our next question. Do you pay prorated quarterly payments for staff who are terminated mid-quarter?
So the requirement is to meet the minimum salaries during the time that an employee is employed by the facility. So remember, these are not payments that go directly to individual educators. They are payments for the facilities to support them in meeting the minimum salaries. So if an employee is no longer working at the facility, then and the employer is not paying them, then we would be looking again for that documentation of the termination letter to know when that employee relationship ended.
Our next question here, someone is asking in regards to the information on slide 11, do we have to provide all items that are listed for evidence of increased salaries or just one or two items? Jared, could you go back to slide 11?
I think while we're going back, that this is a question about the payroll documentation. And if that's the case, we have offered a number of different ways in which a facility can show compliance with the minimum salaries, recognizing that there are different models of how you pay your employees. So some people have a formal payroll system and can easily retrieve documents through that. In others, they're going to show us canceled checks and timesheets to be able to show when they paid educators. So if that's the question, you do not need to provide all of that documentation. The other pieces, in addition to payroll documents, such as the offer letter, hire letter, those kinds of things, those are required.
Alrighty, another question about salary letters. Someone is asking, is there a salary letter template available, or do we need to create our own?
We do not have a template on the OSSI website. I think the best thing to do would be to look at that provider agreement that outlines what's required to be in the letter to make sure that you're meeting all of those requirements. But it can be, quite simple and just include those components that are listed in the agreement.
Our next question, I think this is probably one for Angela. Do we need to provide the pay stub for every month or only for the current quarter?
Sure. So it would be for the quarter for which you are being monitored for that staff member and any eligible staff member who was listed in DELT.
Someone is asking, do we have any timeline for when the monitoring process will launch? We can tell you that the monitoring process will be launching this summer. All providers will receive a notification when it is time for the monitoring process to start, and you will have at least 30 days notice to do so. Hannah, I am seeing some questions here about fiscal year 2025. Is there any information that you can share? Someone is asking, when will we learn the minimum salary requirements starting October 1st, 2024?
That is a great question. And we do understand how anxious providers are to have this information. I want to first say that we are just incredibly grateful that the council has included funding for the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund in fiscal year 25 in the DC budget. Thanks to many of you participated in advocacy on behalf of that effort. So the program will continue in fiscal year 25. I think many of you also know that OSSI is working with the Early Childhood Educator Equitable Compensation Task Force that has reconvened to make some changes to the program in order to be able to meet the fiscal constraints that we are under and to establish the minimum salaries and a formula going forward. So we understand that folks want to have that information as soon as possible. We will be sharing it out just as soon as we can, but the task force will be working throughout the summer to figure out next steps for fiscal year 25 and beyond. So we'll look forward to sharing information just as soon as we can.
Thank you. Another question related to pay. They said, what should I do if a staff member got paid more than they were supposed to, and the pay stub reflects that? And when we found out that it was wrong and adjusted the pay on the next pay, would we be penalized?
So long as that educator was always paid at least the minimum salary corresponding to their role and credential, then that would not be a problem. So, assuming that in both cases, the lowered salary as well is still meeting that minimum, the program would be in compliance with the Pay Equity Fund.
Our next question here is, one of my employees is not enrolled in the Pay Equity Fund. Do I need to provide payroll? I think that this person is probably employed in an ineligible staff type, so they're not included in the formula award. So does this person need to submit documentation for staff who are employed in ineligible staff types?
If they are not in an eligible staff type, they do not have to submit that documentation. This is for staff who are in an eligible staff type. I just want to make sure, because that sounds ineligible, eligible sounds confusing. They have to be an eligible staff type. That's who we're looking to monitor.
Another person is asking, can we provide a payroll quarterly earnings report instead of all pay stubs?
We may need to discuss the specifics of that. I would encourage you to reach out and ask that question. Essentially, the documentation must be able to show at the individual employee level that those minimum salaries were met. So if that information is available in documentation that you provide, it should be okay, but we can, again, you can follow up with specifics on those questions.
Our next question is, if a teacher's staff type is incorrect in DELT and hasn't been corrected, how can a provider verify the staff receive the correct salary for their staff type?
Hi, yes. I would say if you're trying to verify if that staff member received the correct award, you should reach out to the Pay Equity inbox and send that specific name of that person if the award was incorrect or you believe that the staff type was incorrect, because then we have to if it's an issue related to the staff record not being updated and dealt, we have to look into seeing whether that staff record was updated timely, and if it was, we have to talk to our licensing team. So you should send that over to our Pay Equity inbox.
Thanks, Angela. Our next question is a question about minimum salary requirements. So this person is asking, if an employee is currently in a CDA program, is it justified that the employee receive the minimum pay rate of $17.10 an hour?
Yep. Hi, Julia. I can take that one. So I just want to plug here. I'm going to put this in the chat. This is the minimum salary requirements for child development facilities. If you have a staff member listed in with a credential less than a CDA, the minimum salary hourly rate is $21.09. I would strongly encourage you to look at that resource, which again shows minimum salaries annually and hourly, and you should look at that based on the role, the credential that your staff has, and the minimum salaries that are required.
Our next question is, we have an employee who is using paid FLMA, so it's family medical leave, for a period of time, and the pay equity funds were already received for that quarter. How do we handle the funds that were not paid as salary to the employee?
I can take that, and maybe we can also put in the chat a two-pager that we have around changes in staffing that happened during a quarter. The top line is to understand that the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund is a revenue source for facilities to provide those facilities resources to be able to raise the wages of eligible educators. Even though your quarterly award statement does outline the names of individual educators, the funds are no longer tied specifically to those individuals, right? These are not supplemental payments to the individual. So all of that to say is that if there is a staff person who is on leave for a period of time, if there's a staff person who's no longer working, those resources that the facility used should be used in other ways that support the purposes of the Early Childhood Educator Fund. They can go towards staff compensation, but they do not need to go directly to that individual educator. So the facility has those resources to use in ways that are consistent with the uses of the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund.
Thank you, Hannah. Let's see. Our next question comes from someone who's saying, what if you have no staff? So maybe this is a home provider. That's not clear, but how should someone go about reporting if they do not have any staff?
You will not be monitored through this process for the compliance with the minimum salary requirements. We will, be reaching out on other non-fiscal requirements. So again, making sure that you follow all of the requirements of the Early Childhood Pay Equity Fund, the classroom observations, the reporting of tuition and enrollment data, and any requirements if it's an individual provider with an approved waiver. But we will not be looking at the salaries of home providers or expanded home caregivers. We will only be looking at the salaries paid to employees. So if you are a home caregiver and employ other individuals in an associate home caregiver role, then you would need to meet the minimum salaries. Otherwise, you will not need to provide payroll documentation.
And another payroll documentation question, someone is asking, is one payroll journal from each quarter sufficient that includes all teachers, or do you require more documentation that is individualized?
So what I'll say to that is that again, I think Hannah said it before, is that we need the backup documentation that supports that these educators did get the minimum salaries. So I would say that if you're just providing us with an Excel spreadsheet or something similar to that nature, we're going to need the backup documentation, payroll documentation that supports that. So like Hannah had mentioned, if it's a smaller provider and we're talking about canceled checks or bank statements, things of that nature, that's why everything that we have where providers are submitting is through a secure link. And so we want to just make sure that that information is shared with us so we know that educators were paid the minimum salaries.
Thank you. The person who asked about the payroll journal said it is from the payroll system and would correspond with their employment agreements. Thank you for sharing that. We have about 5 minutes left for questions. So if you haven't used the Q&A and have a question, please drop it in the chat. Hannah, I can see there are some folks asking questions about FY25. Someone said, how long will the pay equity fund last for providers? Can you just share a little or repeat what you shared earlier about what we're looking forward to in fiscal year 25 starting on October 1st?
Right. So we do now have confirmation that the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund will be funded in fiscal year 25 and and going forward. So we have not yet put out information on the specifics of the minimum salaries and the what you can expect through the formula awards for fiscal year 25, because there will be some changes to the program based on the funding level for fiscal year 25 and recommendations that come from the Early Childhood Educator Compensation Task Force. So as soon as we have that information, we will share it. We know it's challenging to not have this information, but we are just enormously grateful that the fund will continue to operate. And now that we know that it will, our priority is to get the information to you as soon as we can.
Let's see, a question just came in about corrective actions. So someone is asking, what corrective actions will a provider have if they are found to be non-compliant?
Sure, I can take this.
Okay.
So there's a series of actions that will be put in place. First is that an individual provider that is found to be non-compliant will be given a corrective action plan. The provider should implement that corrective action plan to comply with the requirements. They will need to, the corrective action plan will consist of correcting the finding of noncompliance, and specifically that will likely include providing proof of compliance with the minimum salary requirements for all eligible educators going forward, including a plan for reconciling any pay that is owed that was not paid to educators. If a provider is unable to do that, they may submit an application for a waiver of compliance with the minimum salary requirements. And that's something that we will explain the process for going forward in more detail. Providers may appeal a finding of noncompliance, and if they fail to correct a finding, they would be on probationary status.
Thank you. We have some questions coming in about this monitoring for the pay equity fund happening along the same timelines or timeframes as licensing monitoring, meaning licensing monitoring inspections or renewal inspections. We will be giving providers at least 30 days notice before we actually get underway with our monitoring. So we do encourage you to start gathering the information that we walk through today, just to get a jump start and so that you'll be ready when the time comes. I'll give folks another minute or so to drop in their questions before we close out. Alrighty, we're seeing some questions here about recordings and documents that we've shared during this meeting today. And yes, the presentation is available online. We shared links. We will also be sending out the recording from this session to everyone. And let's see, the last question that's coming in here is, can a provider stop participating in the pay equity fund? Meaning, are they able to opt out if they are currently participating?
I would say that if a provider is wanting to opt out of the pay equity fund, we would want them to be on the same deadline as the opt-in. So we would need to know that, because if you're opting out, we want to make sure that if you received a quarterly award, that you paid the minimum salaries for the time period covering that that award. And so you definitely need to let us know if you're opting out so we can discuss what the timeline looks like. That's a pretty specific question, just because I haven't gotten many of the opt-out questions. So yeah.
So it sounds like the best thing to do in that scenario is to email aussie.ecepayequity@dc.gov. I think the team can probably also work through thinking about if a waiver might be something that would be useful. So that's another opportunity to get some technical assistance there.
I'd also like to clarify that for any quarter in which a provider participated in the pay equity fund, they will still be monitored for compliance with the minimum salary. So even if you opt out going forward, the quarters during which you participated, you will be subject to monitoring.
Thank you, Hannah. Yep.
Alrighty, with that, I think we'll close out this afternoon's session. So thank you everyone who joined us today. For more information on the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund, please visit the Aussie website. We can drop a link to that in the chat. We'll also encourage you to check out some resources that are available, including the monitoring policy and the guide for the monitoring process. We'll include those in the chat as well. I'll also flag that we will have another session this evening. We will cover all the same content, but if you want to tune in again, we invite you to. And we will be sending a follow-up email with all of these links and recordings in the coming days. So thank you again to everyone who has joined us. We look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thanks.